Yu-Gi-Oh differs from a lot of toy-driven anime because it is not primarily an advertisement. I know, really ripping into them right from the start today. While Pokemon, Beyblade, and Bakugan all came after the Pokemon games, Beyblade Toy, and Bakugan Balls, Yu-Gi-Oh! The card game actually came after Yu-Gi-Oh! The manga. Welcome to the Core Vision channel, where I do deep dives into obscure toy anime. Today, I'll be talking about what's known as Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0. For those who don't know, there's a reason Yu-Gi-Oh! Means King of Games and not King of Cards. Because originally, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was written as a celebration of games in general, and not to advertise any game in particular. One of the games depicted was Duel Monsters, and this game became so popular with the fans that the mangaka, Kazuki Takahashi, created the Duelist Kingdom arc, expanding the game and eventually leading to the Yu-Gi-Oh! We know and love today. But before that, there was Yu-Gi-Oh's first arc, simply titled Yu-Gi-Oh! These first 59 chapters, comprising 7 volumes, are about much more than just a card game. Covering yo-yos, Digimon, Gachapon, and much more, the manga was a celebration of games in general and a time capsule of popular culture in Japan during the 90s. Because of all that, I kind of consider Season 0 as the ultimate toy anime. So today I'm going to be explaining all of the games and toy references in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! But before that, as any recurrent viewers may know, I usually go above and beyond with context and history, quickly subsuming entire videos. For today, I'm challenging myself to give the history of each toy and game introduced in the manga in only 1 minute. So let's do this. On the very first page of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, we see Yugi playing a game where you poke knives in a barrel trying not to make a pirate inside pop up. The same game makes a brief appearance in Chapter 6. In real life, it's known as Blackbeard in Danger and was created by Tomy in Japan in 1975, and was exported to the West as Pop-Up Pirate. Next up is the Millennium Puzzle, which is really just a 3D version of a jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle is thought to have originated in Britain in 1760 by the cartographer John Spilsbury as a teaching aid. Early puzzles were made by mounting maps to a sheet of hardwood, and cutting around national borders to teach kids about countries. This cutting is where it gets its name, as jigsaw puzzles are cut with a fret saw. Cardboard puzzles like are used today were unpopular at first due to their perceived lower quality, but after the Great Depression, where they were a cheap form of entertainment, and after price hikes due to the wage increases of World War II, cardboard won out in the end. They became more complex and appealing to adults during the Depression, and actually saw a similar resurgence in popularity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, companies have experimented with designs, including 3D puzzles, as we see in Yu-Gi-Oh! Something you can show but can't see is the riddle hinting at the treasure of the Millennium Puzzle. The answer, of course, being friendship. The word riddle itself could also technically fit as the answer, as you can show the answer by saying it, but it can't literally be seen. It is a word puzzle, and they've existed as long as language has, and our evidence for it goes as far back as the beginning of written language, appearing on clay tablets from Sumeria. Perhaps the most famous ancient riddle is the Riddle of the Sphinx, on screen now. Also appearing in Chapter 17 and all across fiction, riddles are so omnipresent, their history is ironically impossible to really summarize. To decide the order for the first Shadow game, Yugi and a bully play another game, Rock, Paper, Scissors, or Rochambeau, or John Ken. Surprisingly, the game originated from China. The earliest account is the 1600s Ming Dynasty, written in the Wu Zazhu, which claims it dated back all the way to the 200s BCE. It was called 手势令 and imported into Japan as Mushi-ken, ken meaning fist, with frog, slug, and snake in place of the traditional finger fighters. Apparently, the animals were actually different in the Japanese version due to a misreading of Chinese characters. Multiple versions of the game existed before the version you may have heard, Zhangkenpon, appeared in the late 1800s, using the signs we're used to. Through increased contact with the West, the game was eventually spread by travelers to Americans and Britons through newspapers, magazines, and novels. Chapter 1, Game 5, Knife Games. The first Shadow game involves Yugi and a hall monitor, stabbing piles of money on their hands to see who can get the most bills without injury. This may be inspired by a game simply known as the Knife Game, where a participant stabs a knife between their fingers to a particular rhythm while avoiding stabbing themselves. While it was popularized by a viral internet trend from YouTube in the early 2010s, it's actually been around since the mid-20th century. Its origins seem unknown. It's in Chapter 2 that we get the name drop for where Yugi and his friends live. Domino City. Dominoes is another game that originated in China, this time in the 12th century. They were mainly used in gambling and functioned as an intermediary step from the development of dice into playing cards. They would change over the decades, becoming the traditional 32-piece set, with tiles representing every possible face of 2 thrown dice. From their playing card origins, Chinese dominoes are also split into 2 suits, military and civil. It's in the 18th century that the game appeared in Italy, where it then spread to Europe. It became most popular in France and Belgium, but soon took over the entire world. While nowadays you may think of dominoes alongside the trick videos on early YouTube, they are actually used in a number of games, with the variety of rules exploding as they spread across the world. The second Shadow game involves dice, and they are prominent for the rest of the series. Dice are probably one of the most ancient game devices, dating back to even older than your mom. The game of dice was conceived of in prehistory, with 4-sided pieces made from the knuckle bones of animals. Due to the luck involved, it's thought the game derives from a form of divination that uses animal bones. Civilizations as far-flung as Scotland, Greece, and India used these bone dice, oftentimes carved into the shape of bones out of a softer stone. A 6-sided die very similar to what we use today actually appears as far back as the Indus River Valley civilization 3,000 years ago. But the 6- and 4-sided die that we actually use come from the Roman
tali
and
tesserai
dice. At the end of Chapter 2 is a picture maze. There's 2 histories tied to this one, but mazes show up again, so for now I'll explain the history of this version of the maze. Picture mazes are, as the name suggests, mazes in the shape of a picture, and they're solved with pen and paper rather than by walking through a 3D space. However, they started as normal mazes, as in the 15th century, Francesco Segala, an Italian architect, pioneered a style of mazes that used images. There's no evidence that these decorative mazes were ever actually constructed, but the concept lived on. They became more than just designs in the early 1900s. At the time, to increase readership, many newspapers and magazines added puzzles to their publications, with one such being the picture maze. In the 70s, they became insanely popular to the point where even entire books were just maze games. Of course, with the images often being very child-friendly, they found their ways into comics, books, and eventually, Yugioh. Chapter 3's Shadow game involves karaoke. While not traditionally thought of as a game, well, if I had more time, I could argue a case for it. Songs where the audience sings along have been around for decades, but it wasn't until the domination of portable music in the music industry that karaoke, which differed by its lack of a lead singer, developed. Originally, the word karaoke was used in Japan to refer to any instrumental recordings in place of a live band, but in the 70s, when karaoke machines began to be independently developed across the country, it became applied to them too. At first, they were used in bars and hostess clubs, played by the employees for the patrons, But in the 80s, an innovation came as private rooms where customers could sing appeared. A popular pastime for 4 decades now, this has become a huge and still present part of Japanese culture, eventually making its way into the Yu-Gi-Oh manga. Also seen in Yugi's grandpa's game shop, the sound Perot is used in the 3rd Shadow game. This is a made-up toy that dances when it hears you, but its inclusion in this game is well thought out. A Perot, which the doll is based on, is a stock character in French comedic theater, including pantomime, in which the audience often sings along, in accordance to the theme of the chapter. The Perot specifically became a large part of France's visual culture, and in paintings, it can make no noise, but look to you as if it's listening, much as the sound Perot doll does. As for the Shadow game itself, it's the silence game, which is really a play on the game parents and teachers have kids play when they want them to shut up, the quiet game. While I can't scrounge up a history for such a simple game, one of its other names, Quaker Meeting, might suggest at a very old origin. The 4th Yu-Gi-Oh villain has 777 and fever tattoos and constantly talks about luck, obviously alluding to gambling with slots. The first slot machine was developed by Sitman and Pitt in Brooklyn, New York, 1891. The spinning drum held playing cards in 5 slots, and players would spin it to try and get a good hand like they were playing poker. Automatic payouts for winning were impractical with the number of possible winning hands, so a few years later, Charles Fay in San Francisco developed a simpler slot machine with only 3 slots and 5 symbols. The last one, the Liberty Bell, led to a more patriotic version in the 1900s by Mills. Later on, to get around gambling laws, slot machines would award food prizes, leading to gumball slot machines with fruit symbols reminiscent of gum flavors. The next development came in 1963, with the first electromechanical slot machine made by Bally, setting a foundation for the development of other electronic games and arcades. The final symbol, 7, would be added because of its association with luck, and fever comes from the gambling term referring to a hot streak of wins. Kazuki Takahashi includes a number of games readers can play in his manga. The second of which is a Spot the Difference game. Spot the Difference is another game that was popularized out of newspapers. This time it was most likely made by cartoonists, who could easily save time by making a 2-panel comic with the same picture and only slight alterations. The next Shadow game is against the fake psychic, Kokorano. Here, they play a version of the popular bar game where you try to pull a dollar bill out from under a bottle. I can't find a documented history for this game, but the trick involves a glitch in the matrix where if you pull fast enough, the algorithm doesn't recognize the motion and the inertia script isn't run. Thus, the bottle stays standing. The 6th chapter surrounds a school festival in which a carnival is proposed. Carnivals really date all the way back to ancient Greek and Roman festivals surrounding their gods of alcohol called Dionysian and Saturnalia. In these festivals, people could joke and engage in obscene activities in a ritualistic purge. These would be adopted into the Middle Ages as Christianity took over Europe, and Carnival would start to be celebrated just before Lent, involving a huge feast. The most recognizable and most famous form of carnival would develop in Italy, involving parades, masks, and abuse of Jewish people. Oh god. From there, they would spread around the world with multiple new and rich carnival traditions. And then, as it always does,
the American Empire subsumed this rich tradition and took only its name, carnival, and slapped it onto a product.
In America, carnivals became associated with traveling showmen who set up games and tricks for amusement and profiting. It was then the 1893 Chicago World's Fair that would make the carnival mainstream and establish the games we're familiar with today. One of the carnival games proposed is a basketball free throw game. A common game at carnivals, and often rigged, the game is obviously based on basketball. The game was invented in 1891 when the PE teacher, James Naismith, wanted a game to keep his class active indoors. So he set up a basket on the wall and had them pass around a soccer ball. Eventually a hole was added to the basket to allow the ball to be poked out with a stick, and later the basket was made broader so the ball could just pass straight through. Basketball spread from players to the YMCA, which quickly spread it across North America, where it became popular enough to be included into many carnival games. Look, man, it's a bottle and you try to throw a ring around it. You don't need 1,000 years of tradition to get this one. Another proposed game for the carnival is target practice. Long before guns or even archery, humans depicted animals and practiced attacking them. It's thought that this is what some early cave drawings may have been created for. Soon, wooden depictions of animals would be used. Likely to simplify the production of targets, these became further simplified into the circular design we know today. Darts would have been used with these targets as far back as the 1300s as a pastime for soldiers who would throw sharp objects at boards. It's also thought another origin for the circular target is actually from the use of tree trunks as a dartboard, with their concentric rings offering a scoring system. The next proposed game is the shooting gallery game, and involves everyone's favorite toy, guns! As most of us know, gunpowder was invented in China in the 9th century. Its early use was in fireworks, but eventually became used in what's known as the fire lance, a spear with a bamboo tube containing gunpowder and a projectile. In the 1200s, these proto-guns began to be made of metal and spread to Europe. Often they took the form of a large, bulky cannon that slimmed down over the centuries into the guns we know today. They became incorporated into traditions such as hunting, and playing on that tradition, they were made into a carnival game. The final game is air hockey. Much like Pong, air hockey is a tabletop adaptation of a sport, this time being hockey. It uses air blowing through the table to simulate the slipperiness of a puck on ice, which hockey is known for. However, hockey, named after the hook sticks used in the game, is just one of many similar sports dating back as far as 1200s Ireland, 600 BC Greece, and 4,000-year-old carvings in Egypt. Air hockey, though, is very modern, using the technology of an air table, designed to move heavy objects. Sega released a game using this technology in 1968, inspiring employees at Brunswick Billiards to develop air hockey as we know it today. In Chapter 8, Jinochi is put under a test of courage in order to buy a pair of shoes. The idea of a test of courage is very prominent in Japanese manga and comes from a concept dating all the way back to the Heian period. However, though it's referred to as a test of courage, it presents much more as a trial by ordeal. This is an ancient judicial practice where guilt is determined by a seemingly insurmountable trial that can only be passed by the favor of a god to the innocent person. Often, these trials were rigged so that as long as the person accepted the trial, they would pass, presumably because only an innocent person would take the trial. Jinochi's game was similarly rigged in his favor. In the background of Chapter 8, teens can be seen playing at an arcade. Another popular part of the gaming scene in the 90s, arcades have a long history. The name derives from shopping centers, which often hosted arcades, as the word came to refer to a series of shops, usually involving covered arched walkways. The first arcade games were purely mechanical, beginning with coin-operated skee-ball in 1909, which is why you always see it in arcades, and soon coming to include pinball machines in the 30s. Electromechanical shooting and racing games from Sego and Casco would be developed in the 60s before the advent of electronic gaming in the 70s with Pong and Space Invaders, which made gaming a global phenomenon. Now we're getting to the good stuff. Card games have a deep history, so this one is being split into two parts. This first part is going to focus on the history of card games themselves. Playing cards likely originated in the Tang Dynasty due to the invention of woodblock printing in 9th century China. Evidence is scarce, but we're certain they existed since at least the Song Dynasty. Early on, the cards were used for gambling and drinking games, and it's proposed the cards may have actually functioned more like a currency. The suits and deck size would change over time as cards spread out from Asia, with 4 suits and a courtly theme appearing even in the surviving 12th century Egyptian decks. Controlled by Muslims at the time, it spread from here to Europe after the Crusades, though it's possible it also spread through Spanish contact on the Iberian Peninsula. Playing cards in Europe inherited their Eastern suits and had a troubled history of authorities before eventually Latinizing and spreading across the continent. They jumped around in designs over the next few centuries until they entered the zeitgeist, where a new innovation could be made in America. The first collectible card game was Topps Baseball card game, with a game mat and everything. Baseball was huge at the time, and cards sold with cigarettes and packs of gum spread the idea of TCGs around the country. Later on, in the 90s, when RPGs were gaining traction, Wizards of the Coast sprung up, and needing resources to make a different game, they requested the creation of a simple and cheap game. This led to Magic the Gathering, which Duel Monsters is actually parodying in Yugioh, and which actually had its own manga predating Yu-Gi-Oh!, Duel Masters. With Magic the Gathering and later Yu-Gi-Oh!, card games exploded, as we can see in the next arc of the manga and all subsequent arcs. Alright, this one's gonna be a bit of a grab bag. When Shoddy enters Yugi's mind, we see a bunch of toys in his mind room. First are wooden blocks scattered in both panels, a very common and easy toy to carve from wood. They often had letters carved in them for educational purposes, a use attested to as far back as 1693. The toy train, barbershop, and rake all likely reference the old purpose of toys as objects to train children for adulthood, as well as being popular toys in the past, especially trains. We see a ring toss game, which, along with its use in carnivals, is also used to help babies develop motor skills. There appear to be trading cards behind a robot. Robot toys were popular after World War II with the invention of plastic, as their blocky shapes were easy to make and matched the futurism of the Cold War period. Last is a glass orb, likely referencing magical toys in general, a turtle, as animals are a very common toy, and finally we see a squirmel! A popular toy from the 70s, they're fluffy worms on an invisible string used for tricks. The second Yugi's mind room is an M.C. Escher style maze. That adjective comes from the surrealist artist of the same name, living from 1898 to 1972. And the maze itself dates back in concept all the way to the mythological labyrinth on Crete, said to have been built to trap the legendary Minotaur. Likely, though, the concept came from the labyrinthine ruins of the Palace of Crete. Labyrinths would stay in the European conscious for centuries, even being on some Greek currency, and as Rome formed and then split, European nobles of the second millennia would construct hedge mazes, which would come to America in the form of corn mazes, confusing everyone into thinking maize comes from maize when actually it comes from maize. Confusion. Shoddy's ability to control people through their mind room references puppets. Puppets are essentially articulated dolls on strings and date back to ancient Greece. However, they were also present in India and other parts of the world, with the concept of controlling a human figure expanding to refer to paper dolls, shadow puppets, and much more. Also seen in Chapter 41, one of Shoddy's tests for Yugi involves a game of concentration. This is a type of single-player card game where you try to memorize face-down cards and match them. The game was invented by Sir Frederick Roger Concentration of the English Royal Court on April 20th of the year 1369 CE. He developed the game while trying to memorize his children who, as soon as they turned around, he forgot if they were Protestant or Catholic. It was important to know so he could pair them with the proper other siblings for marriage. much like flipping cards and matching their suits. The next challenge Shadi has for Yugi takes place on a simple board game setup. This is likely a reference to the royal game of Ur. Played in Mesopotamia, this is often cited as the earliest board game ever made. While the original rules are lost, we know from later inscriptions it had the basic functions of a tabletop game, with player pieces and squares players move to after a dice roll, the dice being knuckle bones. The game was seen to have spiritual significance, making it apt for a shadow game with the pharaoh. I actually have a video on this one in the works. In chapter 21, after defeating Shadi, Yugi's next battlefield is in the realm of digital pets. In short, digital pets started of Tamagotchi, invented by Aki Mayata and Akihiro Yokoi. Yokoi mentions being inspired by an advertisement he saw where a kid took his pet turtle with him on a trip, and he wanted to make a substitute for real pets in a similar way that were more portable. With the insane success of Tamagotchi, Bandai, their creators, wanted to make a male version to widen their audience, leading to the creation of Digimon. These were essentially Digimon that could battle like we see in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the next chapter, Yugi and Jinochi hang out with a new friend who loves American comics. And Jinochi brings up his hobby of garage kits, which he actually mentioned way back in chapter 6. Garage kits are models reproducing characters from anime and tokusatsu, originally self-made by fans after the explosion of plastic figures in popularity in Japan during the bubble years, before inevitably being folded into mainstream production in the early 80s. The game Capsule Monsters involves randomized capsules, which are an obvious allusion to Gachapon. Also known as Gashapon, this is a brand of vending machine produced by Bandai in the 60s. The name is an onomatopoeia of the sound the machine and capsule makes. The vending machine dispensed randomized figures, often a part of a set like we see in the manga. Unlike vending toys in the West, these are high quality and they became wildly popular and commonplace in stores across Japan, inspiring series from Pokemon to Yu-Gi-Oh! To every single anime phone game. Chess is referenced in the background of the card shop in chapter 1 and as a part of Capsule Monsters chess. Chess was first written about in 7th century Persia, but in those writings, it's referenced to have arrived from India, suggesting an even more ancient origin. It was originally named 4 divisions, based on the 4 pieces: infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, which later became the pawn, knight, bishop, and rook. The modern name, though, comes from the Persian word for king, Shah, derived to check and chess in English. After the 1200s, chess spread across Europe, with the rules changing closer to their modern counterparts over the next few centuries. We see arcades again in chapter 25, this time focused on fighting games. The first fighting games in the 70s, like Sega's Heavyweight Champion, were based on boxing, but it wasn't until the 80s that modern one-on-one fighting games, taking inspiration from popular martial arts movies at the time, emerged. Using dual joystick controls to use special moves, move through stages, and fight bosses, Karate Champ took heavy inspiration from Bruce Lee films with similar concepts, and some characters were even modeled after Lee. Martial arts games would be popular in arcades, leading to the creation of Street Fighter in the late 80s, which would spread like wildfire in the popular consciousness, leading to its reference in Yu-Gi-Oh! When the Yu-Gi-Oh! Crew next see Mokuba at the beginning of the Death Tea arc, he challenges them to what's essentially a game of Russian roulette. While a simple game in concept, our first written evidence of it being played comes from an 1840 Russian short story. Shockingly, I don't think many people were eager to devise such a game in prior centuries of gun technology. Death Tea takes the form of a large amusement park. These originate in medieval parks for amusement. They likely also developed from traveling fairs, the oldest of which is the Bartholomew Fair from the 1100s England. These fairs would develop into amusement parks in the late 1800s with the innovation of mechanical rides such as the carousel, which was steam-powered at the time. These then became permanent parks after World's Fairs were successful in boosting American cities. It was at one of these World Fairs that the Ferris wheel was first shown off in 1893. Shortly after, the first fixed park was founded on Coney Island, and in 1955, perhaps the most influential park, Walt Disney World, would open up. The opening of a Disney World in Japan 3 decades later would be seen as a huge cultural moment and may have played a role in inspiring Takahashi to include a park in his manga. I will count this as a 3D simulation ride, which were popular in the mid-90s as computer graphics technology became more advanced. They were popular in larger amusement parks, though recently they've been replaced by chairs and VR headsets. The first simulator rides were made for military use. Funny, as that was Kaiba Corp's original customer base too, but they were purely mechanical rather than virtual. Much like simulator rides, the laser tag games were originally developed for military use. Once again reminding us that American innovation comes from public rather than private spending. Created in the 70s as a form of combat training using infrared beams, the tech was originally used to make Star Trek toys, before Star Wars inspired one George Carter III to make the first photon laser tag arena in Texas, 1984. It caught on quickly, and laser tag arenas appeared in parks around the world. The next game of Death Tea involves a haunted house mixed with a roller coaster. Haunted houses are a form of a test of courage, but the more interesting history is with the roller coaster. The first one was built in the 1600s, known as Russian mountains, which were more of sledding hills. Later constructions in the 1700s would use wooden trolleys during the summer when the snow wasn't out. This is the use that other Europeans would emulate in England and France, creating more designs for these gravity-driven rails, which were still one way as of yet. It wasn't until the opening of Coney Island's amusement park, it all comes full circle, that the first full circuit coaster was made. 1919 led to advancements in coaster technology, and finally, in 1959, Disneyland introduces the tubular steel track, allowing for more innovative designs. Okay, the whole death game thing by a billionaire, yeah, he's just having them play Squid Game. I can't believe Yu-Gi-Oh! Ripped off Squid Game. The last game of Death Tea, before Yugi faces Kayaba, is a real-life version of Tetris. Tetris is a wild history, and really just watch Gaming Historian's video on it. But in brief, it was developed by Alexei Pajnatov in 1985's USSR, based on a childhood game of his that used pentominoes, which he simplified down to make the game less confusing. He named it Tetris after the tetra pieces and his favorite sport, tennis. After being noticed by a video game broker, a series of complicated rights discussion ensued, eventually leading to Tetris being ported to every console under the sun. In Chapter 41, Yugi and Anzu try out a love testing device. Likely not referencing any particular device, love testing devices have been popular for decades. Some appear in arcades, but from what I can find, the first handheld device is the Love Tester by Nintendo in 1969. It was actually designed by Gunpei Yokoi, who later created the Game & Watch and the Game Boy. After the principal finds Yugi's love test device, he makes them play a game of hide-and-seek for it. The game, originally called Apodidraskanda, originates in 2nd century Greece and has basically remained unchanged since. In the next chapter, Jonochi appears on a game show. Game shows first appeared on the radio and television simultaneously in 1938, with Information Please and Spelling Bee, respectively. They were mostly quiz shows, later diversifying in the 70s with more gamey elements, becoming a popular fixture of television, leading to their inclusion in the Yu-Gi-Oh manga. One of the games in the game show is darts, which we've already spoken about before. The next is a game similar to Operation, where Jonochi has to run through a maze without touching its sides. The game was invented in 1964 by a student at the University of Illinois. He sold the concept to the toy designer Marvin Glass with the promise of a job when he graduated. This was not given to him. The game uses the gimmick of circuits which complete upon touching of the metal scalpel to the metal sides of the board game, and has frustrated children for decades ever since. It was the first, but not last, toy I threw in a fireplace. The next chapter has a handheld boxing game with collectible figures. This is clearly reminiscent of Rock'em Sock'em Robots, which was built in 1964. Originally, it was going to use humans, but after the death of the boxer, Davey Moore, it was decided to dehumanize the figures. The game was actually based on an early arcade machine called Silver Gloves in 1948, which did feature 2 human boxers. Also, shout out to the toy company that made it, it was called Marx. Solitaire features in the next chapter. This is another single-player card game, literally named after that fact. Its origins are unclear, but it seems to have originated from Northern Europe in the late 1700s. At the beginning of the next chapter, Yugi brings up an ancient Egyptian board game designed around a frog. This is actually a version of Hounds and Jackals, named after the shapes of the pieces in the game. Over 4,000 years old, the game is played by moving the pegs around holes in the board. I have no basis for what I'm about to say, but I choose to believe it led to the Cracker Barrel game. In chapter 46 of the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga, we come upon a game called Dragon Cards, which appears to be a Taoist alternative to the Egyptian Duel Monsters. Imori gives the history of the game as originating in China by a Taoist master as the final test for Feng Shui students. And the game has an elemental system, which may have inspired the later development of Duel Monsters. This history is most likely a lie, I can't find it repeated anywhere else. Originally, I thought the next chapter was based on the 90s fad, Super Yo-Yo. They even name drop it, but somehow it predated the real Super Yo-Yo. Actually, yo-yos were a fad in the 90s, but they existed long before. The first yo-yo appears in Greek pottery dating back to the year 440 BCE, and they existed as children's toys for centuries until the first yo-yo company opened up in 1928. It was made by a Filipino immigrant, and it's the Philippine language that the word yo-yo derives from. His company was later bought by Duncan, and yo-yos slowly evolved until the development of ball bearings in the 70s and 80s, leading to a popular resurgence that continued into the 90s. The final game in Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0, and one Takahashi has gushed about in multiple post-chapter segments, is the tabletop role-playing game. It's thought that TTRPGs have their origins in chess, which diversified into multiple wargames between the 18th and 19th centuries. But it wasn't until the late 1900s when Braunstein, the first TTRPG, was developed by David Wesley, who then went on to create Chainmail, a medieval tabletop wargame in 1971. Both became inspirations for Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. Hugely influential, it became essentially the template from which later TTRPGs would follow and is by far the most recognizable. Phew, and we make it to the end. This is why I call Yu-Gi-Oh! The ultimate toy anime and toy manga. It was truly created as a celebration of all things toys and gaming, without any product to sell or ulterior motive. Takahashi just loved physical games and wanted to share his love with others, even putting multiple games at the end of chapters that readers could play. However, 59 chapters later, and with 51 games and toys referenced, the first arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! Ends. After Yugi and his friends defeat Bakura in a 10-chapter multi-volume battle, the manga went on hiatus as Takahashi retooled his manga for a new theme. Because ultimately, fans came to really love the card game he created and wanted to play it for themselves. So, like all great media properties, it was subsumed into the consumerist machine. But hey, I'm kinda glad, it means I get to talk about it more. Stay tuned for next month's videos, which is a full-on retrospective of Yu-Gi-Oh! Season 0. Thanks for watching all the way through. It was a lot of fun getting to talk about the history of so many toys at once, and if that interests you, be sure to check out some of my longer history videos. I have one about Beyblade, and I'm currently working on a Digimon video to come out soon. I've also got reviews of toy anime, with my most recent being about the insane story of a toy based on barcodes that is somehow one of the best things I have ever read. So be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and sell me your firstborn son. Goodbye.